Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'm going to be speaking today with Steve UJLAKI, writer, producer, director of the documentary Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy. And you can learn more at badfaithdocumentary.com. All one word, badfaithdocumentary.com. On Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn. Podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TerrenceMcNally, all one word, terrencemcnally.net. Needless to say, we are deep into election season. I encourage you to get involved not only with candidate campaigns, but also with efforts to fight voter suppression and assure that all Americans get their right to vote, as if the future depends on it, which it very much does. For those of you in safe states like California, where the presidential race may be a foregone conclusion for one party or the other, you can make a difference in down-ballot races to help win congressional, state, local seats and build a future of progressive office holders. Here's some specific recommendations. One, the Democratic Party and its candidates are far from perfect, but if we are to have ever again a viable multi-party system, I strongly recommend you repudiate the Republican Party up and down the ballot for their anti-government, anti-democracy, voter-suppressing, minority-ruling ways. Second, to get involved in campaigns, I recommend you check out thirdact.org. Third Act, one word, .org. It's an organization founded by Bill McKibben in 2021 to empower elders, those 60 and above, to protect the climate and strengthen democracy. You can find them at thirdact.org, as I said. And Third Act SoCal has launched a project called Adopt a District so that voters in the safe state of California can work in 4 swing congressional races to flip the House. Go to thirdact.org/SoCal, SoCal, and scroll down and click on California is the swing state for the House. Other good organizations that can plug you into battleground states is Our Revolution, all one word, ourrevolution.com, founded by Bernie Sanders, Indivisible, indivisible.org, mobilize.us, and a wonderful thing that I've only recently been turned on to is Jessica Craven has a Substack called Chop Wood, Carry Water, Daily Actions, all one word, Chop Wood, Carry Water, Daily Actions at Substack. It's wonderful. To donate money, I highly recommend Movement Voter Project, who help progressive donors support electoral efforts of local, grassroots, community-based organizations in key states. Rather than your money going to a lot of TV ads and expensive consultants, it goes to people who are on the ground before the election, who will be on the ground after the election, and who will help elect not only the presidential candidate you favor, but also progressive folks up and down the ballot. You can find them at movement.vote, movement.vote. Now to today's conversation. Let me open with 2 points. First, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my personal relationship to religion. And second, America's current scourge of minority rule. And that'll set us up for the conversation on bad faith. I was brought up Christian, Catholic to be specific, 10 years of Catholic school, altar boy, choir. There was a time in my boyhood when I aspired to a priestly vocation. Over the years, as I became more spiritual, I became less religious. But I've always been partial to the Sermon on the Mount, the Golden Rule, bring me the poor, the sick, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I give thanks daily for the gift of life and the moments of my life. I now aspire to compassion, justice, forgiveness, what I see as the teachings of Christ. But at the same time, as my views were evolving, so were those of a segment of evangelical Christianity, which has become synonymous with bigotry, intolerance, misogyny, carelessness, and cruelty, and has, through its alignment with the right and the Republican Party, come to exert considerable and dangerous influence on society, and that will be the subject of today's conversation. The U.S. holds only one national popular vote, that for president and vice president, and the Republican Party has won that vote only once since 1988. That's 35 years, once in 35 years. Yet they've held the presidency nearly 12 of those years, due to the Electoral College, and they have held Senate majorities for many of those years, though often receiving millions fewer votes in Senate elections. They currently have one more senator than the Democrats, whose majority depends on the vote of 3 independents. And to focus on the one glaring result, which has been in our face for the last couple of years, they dominate the Supreme Court. Since Nixon, Republicans have appointed 15 justices, Democrats 4. Since Reagan, it's 11-4, and since the 1988 election of Bush Sr., 7-4. A president who lost the popular vote can nominate a justice who is confirmed by a Senate that represents a minority of the population. Brett Kavanaugh, for example, was nominated by Trump, who lost the popular vote, and confirmed by senators who represented only 44% of the population. For the first time in history, 5 out of the 6 conservative justices were appointed by Republican presidents who lost the popular vote and were confirmed by senators elected by a minority of Americans. And as we have seen, this is a radical right-wing 6-3 majority who has reversed in crucial rulings on gun control, government regulation, and Roe v. Wade. The documentary Bad Faith opens with the following text over an image of D.C. and the Capitol. This is the quote: "Christian nationalism is a political movement that believes America was founded as a Christian nation, privileging Christianity over all other faiths. Masquerading as religion, this ideology exploits scripture and sacred symbols to achieve extremist objectives." The film goes on to lay out the timeline, connect the dots, and make clear that 1, Christian nationalism is a political movement first, not a religious one. 2, since emerging in the 1970s and early 80s, Christian nationalism in its current form has been relentless, well-funded, absolutely cynical, and frighteningly successful. And 3, Christian nationalists have achieved much of what they set out to do. Note those recent Supreme Court decisions. But if Trump is elected to a second term, they have plans. See Project 2025. They have plans to expand their hold on our government. Just an example. Imagine Thomas and Alito retire from the Supreme Court and are replaced by 2 younger judges, equally as extreme and corrupt, who will then serve for another 30-plus years. Nothing I've read or seen tells this story, highlights its danger, and sounds its alarm better than Bad Faith. I highly recommend you see it and spread the word. One of the things the film makes clear is that one of the powers of Christian nationalists is their call to fear in order to motivate their followers. Well, at this moment, with the election day a month away, the film, my guest, and I are willing to do the same thing. Stephen UJLAKI has produced over 30 feature films and documentaries, including Patriotism, Inc., Against the Vietnam War, and With Intent to Harm, which advocated prison reform. From 2010 to 2018, he was Dean of the School of Film and Television at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And while Dean, he produced The Hollywood Masters, 50 filmed interviews with Hollywood and European movie greats, a series sold to Netflix. He's currently a professor of screenwriting at Loyola Marymount, and as I said, he's one of the writers, one of the producers, and one of the directors with Chris Jones of the documentary Bad Faith. Welcome, Steve UJLAKI, to Freeform, a world that just might work.
Thank you, Terrence. Glad to be here.
Let me tell listeners we're recording Friday, October 4th. I'd like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas we talk about. So before we jump into the film, let's talk a bit about you. Can you tell us briefly how you see your path to the work you do today? And feel free to go way back, mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision. But let me just set you up. You are just a few years older than I. You graduated Harvard in 1965. I entered the following fall. You then headed for Europe for the next few years. Here's some questions around that. What was college like for you as the civil rights movement is achieving success under Lyndon Johnson, But before all hell breaks loose on campus with sex, drugs, and opposition to the war. And how did you deal with the draft? Why did you head to Europe? And what was that experience in Europe in the late 60s, the mid to late 60s? For those who don't remember, 1968 was momentous in the U.S. with assassinations, riots, the Chicago Convention, and so on. But it was a significant, significant year in Europe as well. So take it from there.
Okay, all right, you set it up very, very well. Harvard, when I got there in 1961, was still the 50s.
Uh-huh.
It was only, yeah, no question about it. Then I had a roommate, and this, after a few years in, who was very politically motivated and would go down south at risk of his life, because some people had been killed in 63, went down and tried to campaign to try to get people to vote. And that was something that I thought, boy, he's really brave to do that. I don't think I would risk my life. Anyway, so that was a roommate who I was very proud of, but I wouldn't do it myself.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated in 65. I had gotten into Harvard Law School, and I had been a big debater, as well as I'd been a big debater at my Jesuit high school. And I, for a while, thought I'd become Perry Mason. But then in the course of my years in college, the new wave occurred in Europe. I was fascinated by what could be done with film. And I then decided that I would go to a French film school because I spoke French, because my parents spoke French. And I then also realized that if I went to law school, when I graduated, I would have to automatically be in the Army.
Uh-huh.
So that was also weighing so that was weighing on me. So it was a combination. So I went to the film school, and while there, I became radicalized. 68 happened. I didn't have the American 68 experience. I had the European 68 experience. And it was very close to, at a certain point, we felt that the government was going to be brought down. I mean, it was much more serious in terms of an actual attempt to overturn the government.
And you're talking about the country of France?
Yes, this is in France.
Yeah.
This is in France. It was really, it's a whole other story.
Right.
And plus I got in prison for a month, been involved in stuff, and I got deported. So I ended up in Sweden. But Europe was very determining for me in a lot of ways. And my interest initially had always been in history. My thesis at Harvard was in the historiography. It was a comparison between 19th century French and English historians. But I also realized that academia was completely boring. But I still, that was, as a career, there was not anything I wanted to do. But I was interested in history. I got into film because of the art of film, and also because of its potential to be political and to change people's minds. Like the Battle of Algiers was one of the great films ever made, and it had a huge impact in terms of dealing with a crisis that when I was in France, Algeria had just been declared independent, and there was a huge amount of feeling anti-Arab, there was a lot going on there in the midst of all the turmoil, the political turmoil, the new wave experience. It was a very heady experience for me to get away and look at America in a completely different light than it's possible to have when you're actually in it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I was there for about 6.5 years.
6.5. Okay, two questions there. So your time in Europe and your entry into film school in Europe, that was how you avoided the draft?
Well, that's how I initially thought I was going to try the film school to see if I liked it well enough for a year or so. And if I didn't, I would go back to Harvard Law School and I would bite the bullet and I would go to law school and then have to do the draft. However, all I can say is after spending a couple months in Paris, the idea of going back to the United States was the last thing on my mind. I was not the first American to feel a sense of personal political and sexual liberation,
Yeah.
outside of the country. Um, so yeah,
Okay. And
and
then,
ultimately, just on the draft story,
yeah.
they did draft me, but I was in Europe at the time, and I got a draft notice saying, okay, you're due at your draft board in New York next Monday. I mean, by the time the mail actually got to me. And then I did succeed in going to Brussels to get my exam, and I played crazy and got out of the draft.
Okay.
So
Yeah. I mean, for someone our age, it's a question.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
I got
yeah.
out through football injuries. Legitimate, but
Hmm.
that's how I got out.
Sure.
And
Whatever it takes.
yeah,
Whatever it takes.
exactly. I also, though, acted crazy and on and on, but those injuries that got me out. You came back in 6.5 years. Why?
Well, I came back for two reasons. One, my mother had convinced me that my father was in very, very bad health
Mm-hmm.
and that he was at risk of dying. But the other thing was the war um, the Vietnam War, as experienced by me in France and then in Sweden, because I was in Sweden for 2.5 years after France, was so devastating. And the fact that I was, a filmmaker, I thought I wanted to be a filmmaker. I started making a few documentaries. I just wanted to go back and do a documentary on the war. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to participate in this because it was so heinous what was happening. And it was like the truth of the reality was presented much more clearly in Europe than it ever was in America. I mean, it, that's just the reality. So it was devastating. I mean, and everybody was against it. It was clearly genocidal. It was completely, absolutely crazy. And yet, if you looked at America and American politics, it felt as though people had been anesthetized or something. Yes, there was an anti-war movement, but it wasn't all that big initially. That's for sure.
Right, right.
So
And
that's
what
why I
you're
went
saying
back.
is
I
that
went
is
back.
over
Yeah.
there it was the consensus that it was wrong and crazy, and over here it
Yes.
was contentious.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you came back to
Yeah.
make film against the war, and is that where Patriotism Inc. comes?
That's exactly right. I got a job. I mean, just I was touring colleges just for fun almost when I was visiting my parents. And it turned out that there was an opening in Brandeis. Somebody had some freak accident. Somebody had been killed in a car accident. They were
Oh.
looking for an opening. They said, "Hey, could you start in 3 weeks?" And I had no intention of going back that quickly, but I took the job, I came back, and I had my course was teaching documentaries, and also I had a graduate class, and I said, "Hey, let's make a documentary." This was my way of doing it. So I got the grads behind it. We did a film. We interviewed the Minutemen of Concord, who did war reenactments,
Uh-huh.
and it was all about the point of the documentary was to show how the connection between the parades, the military parades, all this was the socialization process by which people were convinced that true patriots would go to war and kill Vietnamese. So that was, and then actually I finished the film. Brandeis saw it. They tried to take it away from me. They did take it away from me. I had to steal it back. I didn't get rehired. Um, I got the film made, but I couldn't get it shown anywhere except in a few churches because this is an important point. When the war was going on, it was impossible to show something that really showed what was happening on American television, even public television, any television. Total blackout. And that's it's somewhat key to what's happening today in a different vein, that you don't have the mainstream media and so forth are reluctant to tell the actual truth of what's happening. And
Mm-hmm.
I had an experience of that 50 years ago.
Wow.
It was only after the war was over that it got onto television.
Right, right.
So, yeah,
That is, I kind of assume that's what was going on, but for you to actually, here's the document and just be
yeah.
turned aside. Um, so so when so now you're bounced from Brandeis, you've made the one documentary with your grad students. Is that when you come out to L.A.?
Yeah. No, no. What happened was I had no desire actually to come to LA. I was not interested in Hollywood movies. I got hired by a guy named Leon Botstein,
Mm-hmm.
who's been a longtime president of BARD for
Yeah.
many, many years. Leon was the president of a very small, kind of a hippy dippy college in Franconia, New Hampshire. And he contacted me and said he wanted me to start a film program. So once again, so I, bought material, I bought equipment, editing, so forth, in order for me to make films as well as to teach the students filmmaking. And then I made a few other films. I made a couple films about prison reform in Massachusetts because they had a reform head of sections who was trying to implement changes in this incredibly racist and really terrible prison system. If any of you have seen Titicut Follies,
Right.
of Fred Weissman, that's just a taste of what life was like in prisons in Massachusetts and elsewhere. So I did a couple of those while teaching. But then ultimately, I came out to LA in '75 because I realized that nothing was, nobody was seeing these films. They did get shown, actually, the prison film got shown on New Hampshire PBS because they got some money from them. But I felt, what the hell, I'm going to go to LA. And I did that in '75. And it turned out that none of my interests were shared by anybody. Nobody cared about documentary at that time. And also, I got a bad reaction when I said I went to Harvard. People thought I must be some elitist, and that I spoke several languages. That also was another,
You were overqualified.
Kind of pseudo blue. Well, it's not even overqualified. There was this kind of pseudo bullshit blue collar aesthetic that was sort of popular in LA, which of course was a total farce. But the idea was that if you were going to reach the masses, you had to somehow be one of the masses, although nobody else was, but they sort of concealed it better. So that was.
But what is interesting about that, you and I have spoken offline about that, was that the '70s are now considered this great time for independent films and filmmakers. Peter Biskin's book, Raging Bulls, and so on, all that. But it turns out, from your experience, that was a small club that didn't need a lot more members.
That's right, exactly right. I mean, they were established in the way, and those few people got to do those few films. But as far as if you were a nobody, nobody was actively looking for anything like that. I mean, those films were made against all odds by people who had a lot of, a certain amount of cachet and power to do it, and a lot of money behind, a few with money behind them. But the actual culture had no interest whatsoever. And so it was a tribute that these films got made, and it is, in retrospect, it is one of the heydays. And actually, to my mind, films like Star Wars and Jaws were the beginning of the end.
Exactly.
Of potential for, for Hollywood to be something other, and it's ended up now that animation, I mean, it's given up all pretense of being anything. Any of the value that film could possibly bring to people has been brought down to how much money can you make, and how broad can you go, and in many cases how stupid.
Yeah.
But that's just my feeling. So from an art historical point of view, there's been a decline in the output of Hollywood for the last 40 years.
Oh yeah. Let me just say, by the way, my very first night in Los Angeles, I was traveling around the country in a van. I drove off the 405 into Westwood, and it was about midnight, and I ended up in Westwood, where I'm looking at the Fox and the Bruin theaters, both of which I think are endangered or closed by now. But there are lines for midnight shows, one of them showing Easy Rider and one Midnight Cowboy. And to me, that was the heyday of independent Hollywood. But as you say, just a few years later with Jaws, and then 2 years later Star Wars, these young filmmakers make blockbusters, and we go to blockbusters, and then, as you point out, to now primarily comic book blockbusters, and the best
comic books, then animation. So it's been a gradual step down the ladder.
Yeah. I mean, I will say TV seems now to actually put on interesting stuff and produce interesting stuff, but we'll move on from there. And is that disappointment is what leads you to film school? You were dean of film and television at Loyola Marymount from 2010 to 2018.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I was, what happened, okay, so I had gotten to make a film, a documentary about Cachao with Tom Luddy and Andy Garcia while I was in San Francisco. I was the head of the film department at San Francisco State for 8 years
Aha.
before coming to LA. And I loved doing the documentary again, and I got, very much into that. Then when I was dean, and in 2016, Trump won. It didn't, to my mind, and for the people I knew and anything I read, that was an impossibility. So I became aware that I obviously had very incomplete information, and I, who thought I was so, on top of everything,
Sure.
what a joke that was, in my little liberal bubble. And I couldn't do anything when I was dean, but when I stepped down in 2018, I started doing research on evangelicals. I said, because they were, I knew, just all I knew was that they had been responsible for getting Trump elected. And that's when I started doing my research. And it's been an incredible, I will say that one of the best things about making documentary is the ton of research
Yes.
you get to do so that you know so much about what happened. I mean, this film is just like a very sort of an outline of what the actual full story would be that would require many hours, but it's sort of hopefully the people will pick up on it. But I learned a great deal, and that's the result of that 6 years later. It's bad faith.
So when you two things happen. One, Trump is elected. Two, you leave your
Yeah.
position as dean of the film school, and at that point, you know that what you're going to try to do is learn why Trump got elected. You focus on the evangelicals, and at what point do you know this is a documentary and you've got to make it?
Okay, good point. I mean, I was very fortunate in that when I stepped down as dean, I got a year-long sabbatical,
Uh
which
huh.
is a great thing in academia. You get,
Yeah.
in this case, full pay, and you don't do anything as having reward for having been a dean and gone through all that shit. So I basically, with the evangelicals, all right, I'm sort of going to have you remind me what specific part of this about the evangelicals
Oh, no, I'm just
that you
saying
asked me about
the
that I thought was
question
very
sort of is,
good.
when did you know I'm not just looking into this?
Oh, I got it.
I'm
That
going to
there was
make
a
a
film there. Yeah,
documentary.
got it, got it. Well, good point. The first thing I did was to get some people I knew, former students, to shoot footage of Franklin Graham in the fall of 2018 when he was doing his tour, supposedly prayer tour, but it was really just drumming up, getting people to vote Republican.
And tell people who
Um,
Franklin Graham is.
and I thought, okay, Franklin Graham. Okay, you're right. I feel like I know these
I
people.
know,
And
I
they were
know. Billy
Franklin
Graham's son,
Graham.
right?
Frank Franklin Graham is the son that Billy Graham would probably, turning in his grave at what Franklin Graham has become,
Yeah.
which is a complete toady and stooge for Trump. But Franklin Graham inherited the whole Billy Graham evangelical organization, which is a multi-million dollar, almost $1 billion worldwide operation, and he decided to dedicate his self to Trump. Now, this was not because it was Trump. This goes back to the original deal that I discovered, and I'll answer your question in a moment about when I knew there was a film. I discovered that in the late 70s and the early 80s, that a guy named Paul Weyrich,
Mm-hmm.
who had been attempting to get the evangelicals who did not vote and who believed that the public square was populated by the devil, his long-term goal was to get them on board to vote Republican because he knew that otherwise Republicans were never going to win an election because they were a minority, they represented a minority, and they needed help. And it was a story, and Randall Balmer, who's like the foremost historian of the evangelicals, whom I interviewed in the film,
Mm-hmm.
but talks about having interviewed Weyrich in the early 90s, 1990s, and Weyrich was going on. It was impossible to get them on board, and nothing worked. I couldn't. All the time, I was trying to figure out how to interest them. Pornography, no. Prayer in schools, no. All these other, nothing. Abortion, nothing worked for them. They didn't care. The one thing that actually motivated them to decide to get involved in politics and to throw in with the Republicans was the fact that after the Supreme Court decision about integration was now the law of the land, these people all had these highly well, I mean, they were making a lot of money with these private Christian academies that were segregated. Because what happened in the South was that rather than integrate, they created their own schools and they were getting tax exempt status for these schools. Falwell had a school, Jones had a school, Robertson. After a certain decision, Green versus Connolly in 1972, the decision was made, and it took a while before it actually got to the Supreme Court, that they could no longer enjoy tax-exempt status because, by definition, they're discriminatory.
Right.
And they cannot be considered
the law said tax-exempt charitable organizations cannot practice discrimination. And in Bad Faith, we learn that's the seed of the religious right.
Exactly. Because they were making so much money on these schools, and they also were totally against integration.
Right.
Of course, in their mind, it turned it into biblical. God believed in segregation. Yeah. Jesus believed in segregation. It was biblical, in other words. And so they were simply following God's lead by refusing and not wanting to integrate. Anyway, so that's what did it. That's what did it. Because Weyrich could say to them, listen, with our clout, with the Republican, you have no clout, you have nothing. With our clout, you would join in with us, and we can help make this stuff happen. We can fight back. We can put people on the court. We can do all the things we need to do to return things back to the way you want them.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
now,
let me
okay,
let me tell people that this is Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Steve UJLAKI.
Absolutely, sure.
I'm speaking with Steve UJLAKI, writer, producer, director of the documentary Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy. You can learn more at badfaithdocumentary, all one word, .com. So Weyrich is, I knew of him. I associated him with being the king of direct mail, which he was, and so on. But I did not realize the pivotal leadership, I mean, the ultimate pivotal leadership role he played. And I want to go back with a couple of things here. First thing I want to do, actually, is go back and just see if you agree with me that the first line on the screen, which I read in my introduction, that Christian nationalism is a political movement that believes America was founded as a Christian nation, privileging Christianity over all others, has two gross inaccuracies in it. One, it was not founded as a Christian nation, but two, it was founded on the principle that no one group is privileged over another, right? That it violates
That's right.
both
That's
of
right.
those. And then let me ask you, masquerading as religion, this ideology exploits scripture and sacred symbols to achieve extremist objectives. The second line, masquerading as religion. Now, leaving aside the extreme cases of religion-driven terrorism in the Middle East mostly, although in the United States, as you point out in the film, more and more, and religious-driven wars, as we see in the Middle East right now, couldn't masquerading as religion be said of many self-proclaimed religious institutions? Scientology, a lot of the success gospels, and so on. And let me ask you, you feature some of the success gospels. I see Joel Osteen, I see Paula White, and so on. Have some of those avoided the Christian nationalist political edge just so they can keep, as Michael Jordan said, Republicans buy sneakers too? I imagine there are Democrats who want, a religious way to make money. Have they avoided that, or are most of them in this basket as well?
I can't really answer that exactly. I didn't study that enough to be able to respond to that. But I did want to go back to this one thing that's very important, because it has a bearing on what we're dealing with today. When Weyrich was finally able to convince people like Falwell and Robertson that he should go in, they should go in with Republicans. They said, well, wait a minute, what do we say? How do we do this? What is the reason? What possible reason? They never wanted to vote. They were not interested in politics.
This is what do we say to our congregations? How do we get them involved?
Exactly. What do we say? Weyrich said, very simple. The Republican Party is the party of God,
yeah,
and the Democratic Party is the party of the devil. Literally. And to this day, that has become, if you pardon the expression, the gospel that's the case. But that very simple, and again, another point that maybe is a little in the weeds, but their religion is very, it's manichaeistic.
Yes.
There's good and there's bad, there's black and there's white, there's evil and there's good. Okay, so that within a theological framework is part of actually many religions, but it's very certainly strong amongst evangelicals. That theological framework was now applied to our political culture.
It was kind of grafted onto it, is the way I sort of see it. Grafted onto it.
Yeah. Grafted onto with the ramifications and the consequences that we're living in today, because people, as you see in the film, they're totally convinced that the Democrats are satanic, that they are evil, and you think, where did this come from? Well, very simple. It was a business deal. They figured out they needed to know what to say, and he told them what to say. Then the other thing that happened is they realized they could not be promoting what they're doing as an attempt to push back against integration.
Right. Going back, let me just remind listeners. Let me just remind listeners, going back to the point he originally made, which was that what got them on board was they wanted to protect their tax-exempt status, and they wanted to be able to continue to discriminate. But as you point out, Weyrich realized
the leaders,
right.
Weyrich
realized
motivation, but
you couldn't sell that to your congregations or to the country at large as white supremacy. That's got a limited appeal.
Yeah.
And that's when you say he tries other things and then hits on abortion. And one of the things I learned from the film was that Falwell doesn't make his first anti-abortion sermon until 1978, and Roe v. Wade, remember, was overturned in 1973. So isn't as if...
And not only that, Terence, the Southern Baptist Conference, the most powerful conference, which is kind of the lead conference of all the Baptist churches, applauded Roe versus Wade. They thought it was a good thing. It was going to be helpful. It was going to save, all sorts of unwanted pregnancies. And so they applauded that. So this was something that Baptists in general had no feelings about or to positive. Weyrich, who was a Catholic, an extremist Catholic,
like Alito, for instance.
Like Alito, knew that Catholics responded very strongly to abortion. He monitored various constituencies and various districts, and he came to them and said, look, we have to have a better rallying cry, and you also, for the moral majority to work, there has to be something that you guys and the Catholics can reunite around. They already hate abortion. You need to hate abortion so that we have it. And so abortion, I said, business deal. The evangelical leaders,
So there's two business deals in a way there. Paul Weyrich, it seems, is definitely a Republican operative, but it isn't as if he's totally cynical and just using religion. He also is a religious zealot. Right? I mean,
absolutely.
In him, both are true. But basically, what you have to realize, and what Bad Faith makes really clear, is that it was the political operative side of Weyrich that strategizes to bring on board the evangelicals, and then together they become one thing.
Right. You've got people who are like to be very zealous about wanting religion to be part of everyone's life, and you've got, on the other hand, political operatives who are trying to figure out how to help the Republicans get to win. He was this combination. He was a guy who not only was zealous about all this. In fact, the Catholic Church was too liberal for him. He went to some extreme Greek cult
Mm.
that was even more rigid and more traditional.
Well,
He actually,
uh,
I mean,
was it
yeah,
Opus
go ahead.
Dei or just something like Opus Dei?
No, it wasn't Opus Dei. No,
Yeah.
I mean he was a member of Opus Dei, of course, but
Yeah.
the no, it was the Melkites,
Oh.
which you've never heard of. The
Uh-huh.
Melkites were an extreme, that went back to the origins of Jesus, and the ceremonies had to be, so Weyrich was very much of the school of that school, but he also, I mean, was a brilliant strategist. He teamed up with Richard Viguerie. Viguerie was the king of the mail order
Oh, that's right.
business.
Yep.
Another Catholic, Cajun Catholic, um, and then you have the other guy who's the head of the leadership council, who's still alive, and the three of them put together the moral majority, got Falwell and Robertson on board, and and it's something that was very effective. Reagan got elected.
And by the way, let me just read for people because Weyrich a bit later writes his manifesto. Um,
Yeah.
what he says in that manifesto: we are spreading the gospel in a political context. Make no mistake about it. We are talking about Christianizing America because he feels we have ceded areas of endeavor to the devil. Our movement, this are his words, our movement will be entirely destructive. We will weaken and destroy the existing institutions. Our strategy is to bleed this culture dry. Now, one thing I'm going to ask you, I think, by the way, Weyrich um, deserves the condemnation we're giving him, but my God, from the other side, he deserves an enormous amount of credit. The guy is basically a strategic genius. You have a clip in
Yeah.
there of Bill Moyers. I mean, right? I mean, nobody on the Democratic or progressive side has been as good strategically for as long. Um, he is being questioned by Bill Moyers in 1980. And yet, my guess is that for many people hearing this conversation, this is the first time they've ever heard his name. How, as you looked into it, has that state of affairs remained? And as you said, this was stuff you thought you knew it all, and this was stuff you discovered. How, as you looked into it, how do you explain that?
Okay. Two things. In 1980, there were a number of people who realized that what the Republicans and the evangelicals were doing, this plan that they had, went against separation of church and state.
Mm-hmm.
You had Norman Lear put out PSAs about it. You had various other people saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not what our country is about. But nobody paid. I mean, they basically blithely went ahead and did it. Again, this is our, we have things that we believe in, but they're not against the law, the norms. Says we've learned Republicans have been great at ignoring the norms. But what this came down to was the fact that Bill Moyers, amongst others, was fully aware of what was going on, and he was trying to document it. And he did. He did a great job. He knew absolutely what was happening. He interviewed all of these people, and sounding the alarm, but nobody paid that much attention. Then let me give a little reference to the manifesto and the notion about destroying the culture.
Yes.
Weyrich, Weyrich was a perfectionist, and he was an idealist in his own crazy way.
Mm-hmm.
Even when Bush became president, and the people were prayer in the White House, and evangelicals, and the crusade against
Mm-hmm.
the heathen, all that stuff, he was aware of the fact that society, the American society at large, and this is now by the year 2000, 2002, has not coming along, was not actually becoming more Christian the way they wanted it to. It was not happening. That's when he commissioned the manifesto. And the point of it was democracy is not working for us. We're never going to be the majority. We have to rule by minority. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to weaken and destroy the democratic institutions that exist, and then we're going to take them over. And you see now going up to Project 2025 today, he planted all the seeds for that, and that was part of the plan for the last 20 plus years. What we're experiencing now, the breakdown, the lack of trust in the institutions, was all part of their plan. That, to me, when I saw that, Terrence, was the smoking gun. You said, when did I think I had a film?
Mm-hmm.
It's like I thought, holy shit.
Yeah.
Holy shit. This is always, but they gave up on democracy. They basically had a plan to get around it and achieve what they wanted to achieve. And the other part of this is, it's very important. People say, wait a minute, how do those parishioners, how do those congregations become Christian nationalists? Well, it was happening in broad daylight, but it was all coded. When you had a pastor say, we need to recreate the kingdom of God on earth, you might have thought they were talking about something spiritual. No, they meant replacing democracy
they meant
with
kingdom.
a theocracy.
Yeah.
So they meant kingdom. They meant kingdom. And this is like, again, you had to be on the inside to know what was happening. If you were on, so it was happening in broad daylight. Millions of people were indoctrinated with this. And it didn't take all that much to light the match, to say, okay, now's our time to do it. But that's what happened. It was treason in broad daylight. And it was something that is absolutely despicable. It's something that it destroyed the religion, and it was an attempt to destroy democracy. And again, all I can say is that people need to know this was the plan, this was what they're trying to do, and put Trump in that context. Christian nationalism created him. He's a guy, he's a very lucky guy in a lot of ways, very great opportunist. But had it not been for that grievance and the backlash against Obama, he wouldn't have stood a chance. But all these people were already there. There was an army waiting that Weyrich, first of all, tried to bring into being, going back to the 1980s, to create an army.
Right. But a couple of things you point out. Reagan nominates Sandra Day O'Connor. And the other thing, by the way, you have a clip of Reagan saying, we are going to make America great again, which is just, for anyone who thinks that was Trump's deal, it goes back to Reagan. But Reagan appoints O'Connor, and that's when the religious right realizes they're not going to do what we need. We can use them, but they're not going to do what we need, the Reagans and the Bushes and so on. And that's when he also starts, one thing you haven't mentioned is the Council for National Policy, which is has been his organization since the 80s. And then the other thing he does is he connects with oil money. And that is a crucial thing.
This is huge. This is huge, Terrence. I'm glad you brought this up because I didn't mean to skip over that. I mean, again, sometimes I feel like I get too much in the weeds. But as you pointed out, Reagan violated the platform of the Republican Party of 1980. They were intent absolutely on promoting no abortion, and Reagan went against it.
O'Connor was pro-choice.
She was pro-choice. She was considered to be a
feminist,
God forbid.
Yep.
And all that stuff. So at that point, this is an important thing. At that point, Weyrich, as you said, realized, hey, wait a minute, the Republican Party is not interested in our revolution. They're using us. He set about trying to create a parallel structure, which is a secretive organization that no member was allowed to actually talk about being a member, or that no agenda items or meeting places were ever announced publicly. He got oil and gas money whose interests were purely economic in most cases, deregulation, no government. He said, look, I have a whole legion of voters who can start voting in the way you want them to vote if you give me the money for this organization, Council for National Policy. And that policy, that council that he did, he was considered wacko by the mainstream Republicans. They said, what are you doing? This was a guy who, because they say he's so much of a purist, he's crazy, we're in power, it's happening. But for Weyrich, he was not happy because it was not the vision that he had in terms of Christianizing America. I mean, right now, he died in 2008, but he would be very happy with what's happening right now.
That's right.
The Heritage Foundation, which, by the way, he co-founded in 1973, is now stepping up in a big way with Project 2025, which is exactly the successor to Weyrich's manifesto.
Yeah, and the other thing that Weyrich uses, which I think has him considered too extreme for mainstream republicanism, was this big deal about Satan. And the, as you point out, the good versus evil, so on. One other strain that I want you to talk about is the Dominionists and their Seven Mountains strategy, because that falls within Weyrich's manifesto of destroying the existing institutions. Go ahead.
Okay, the thing that came out, and this guy was Rushdoony, Rousas Rushdoony, um, was the brains, if you will, behind the extreme right desire for a theocratic government. And Bill Moyers interviewed him, and it's in the film. And he said that the democracy is against God's will. And Moyers said, "How is that?" He said, "Well, democracy is the will of the majority. It's not the will of God." So that became their theological underpinning for the fact that democracy, they were already anti-democracy because they realized it wasn't getting them what they wanted. But you had a situation in which this guy had wrote a number of books about how this was going to happen. How was America going to be turned into this theological country? Dominionism was the answer. By breaking the country into 7 different mountains, there was a family, there was school, there was politics.
I've got them here: family,
Yeah,
religion, media, business, education,
yeah,
entertainment, government.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So very specifically, that was how it was going to happen. And we do have in the film the latest guy, Wallnow,
Right.
Wallnow, who's in the film, who's a huge self-proclaimed prophet, who's been pushing this thing and going around, and they have lectures all around the country. In fact, Ann Nelson, who wrote the book Shadow Network that much of the film is based on, has been going around as a reporter. And you have now the latest manifestation of Christian nationalism in action with dominionism and the notion that you have to take territory.
Mm.
This is explicitly demanding that people take action and take territory. And the whole thing is about that they have to pledge allegiance to dominionism. And this is real, and it's happening, and it's spreading. And again, all I can say is that I think one of the reasons that the film has had the success it has is because people look around and realize, wait a minute, the stuff that's in the film, that's all happening. It's all, they can look around and can see that it's happening. I mean, I regret that the film is that, helpful in a way, because what's happened in the course of the several years that I made the film, Terence, is that it became more and more relevant because the country was sinking deeper, deeper into this radicalism. Christian nationalism, when I started, nobody heard of it. I mean, nobody heard of it. I mean, this was not part of the liberal bubble conversation of topics, Christian nationalism, or if they did know what the hell it meant.
Right, and I think the other thing that really, when you pair it with Leonard Leo, also religious zealot, incredible fundraiser, and great strategist who has been focused on the courts, and then you take it to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the overturning of some gun control, and you have people in the film, I think it's Ken Peters, who basically says, we want godly people to own as many guns as possible. And overturned regulation. It's this, the way they all come together. I'm going to give you now sort of your closing statement, but let me throw in there, which I think means get more involved than you already are in making sure that everyone you know votes this election and votes and does not vote for Republicans. But can what I will call normal political motivation, such as social justice warriors, labor leaders, and so on, can that compete against the motivation of holy war?
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, there has been talk of trying to figure out how to create a movement. I mean, you have Reverend Barber in our film who has a trying to continuation of
Martin Luther King Jr.'s,
yes, of the Poor People's Campaign. The idea that if you could unite black and white and brown and yellow, you would have a massive constituency that could actually make our country more democratic, and could combat against the oligarchy that essentially rules our country. And I think, when I say oligarchy, I mean you have the establishment, you have people who are making a lot of money. Why do mainstream newspapers and media not call out in alarm what's going on now? They have a vested interest. Which is unfortunate. So to your point about how do you combat religious fervor? Well, Barber, what he's saying is, hey, wait a minute. You can do that, but this is from what Jesus really meant. It's what you said at the beginning of the program, Terence, that I think was absolutely correct. You grew up as I grew up. What I got out of it was, hey, Jesus was actually had great things that he said that have in Matthew 25. My entire life has been, I've been guided by that. And I'm not, go to church, but Jesus said these things, and his teachings have been completely distorted, ignored. I realized that they didn't even teach the Gospels, or they didn't even preach the Gospels in these mega churches because he's inconvenient.
That's right. Well, let me quote Barber. He says that they can't have that dark-skinned Palestinian Jew who preached the Sermon on the Mount. That's what gets in the way of Christian nationalism and proves it ain't Christian. The problem they got with Jesus.
Right. That's right. That's right. So anyway, so he wants to harness faith, but that's good faith, I would say, as opposed to the bad faith. He wants to harness it. It's not. This movement should not be anti-faith. It should be using what I would call good faith in order to combat bad faith. And if people don't care, if people are not of a religious or spiritual bent, that's fine. They could get involved anyway. They don't have to be. The point is, you don't have to have faith, but you can have a tremendous movement if faith leaders are part of it, in the same way that they were in the 60s when so much progress was made.
Well, that's right.
So
I mean,
really,
one of the things you mentioned, and I think people overlook, is that the right learned from the civil rights movement.
Absolutely.
And and it's one of the insights Weyrich had, was he looked and he said, my God, it grew out of the churches. What if we could do that?
That's right.
We've got to bring this to a close. As you said,
Okay.
as you said,
this is too much fun.
It could be a mini series for sure. But the notion is, if you don't have time to see it between now and the election, hear what we say, get people involved, know what's at stake, and know that's something that you aren't reading in all the mainstream press. This is going on. They are determined. They are a juggernaut. And it is this alliance, as you pointed out, and as we've sort of talked about, between the oligarchs, the fossil fuel oligarchs, and so on. And they use the evangelical Christian nationalist movement. The evangelical Christian nationalist movement uses them, and democracy and the American people and the planet lose. Again, the film is Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy. The website is badfaithdemocracy.com. It's available, Steve, on
badfaithdocumentary.com.
Yeah. Didn't I say that? I think so. And if you go there, you can you rent and buy and all of that?
Yeah. And or host a screening. That's what we've had over 400 screenings across the country. People who are so motivated after they see the film, they can sign up to host a screening, and they license it, and then they show it. We bring speakers. This has been a phenomenon. It's like a grassroots phenomenon that has sprung up.
Which yes, again, I'm glad you pointed that out. That's another way to take it and use it in this coming month and beyond, because no matter who wins this election, they will be at work, just as they have been since the 70s. For this conversation,
they're not going anywhere.
Yes,
they're
right.
Not going anywhere. Yeah.
For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerenceMcNally.net, TerenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to get my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually links to like 10 or 15 articles that are relevant and timely, email me at TeMcNally, TeMcNally @mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on Apple Podcast, most major podcast sites. You'll find years of podcasts at my site and at those sites. I'm actually in the next week or so going to add YouTube. It's one that I hadn't had until now. Listen anytime, anywhere. Michael Lewis, Jeremy Scahill, Naomi Klein, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice. You can follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Steve UJLAKI, and keep up your good work.
My pleasure. Thank you, Terence.
Great.